Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Metropolitan Governance Task Force for this Wednesday, January 10th. And we have a full agenda today, and a number of people are joining us online as well. Appreciate everybody who attended last night's meeting, and feels a little like the legislature at the end of session. We have a late night, and then we come back in the morning. See, Senator Pratt knows that. I said it's a little like the end of session. You have a late night, and then you come back first thing in the morning. Our first item of business today is to adopt the previous minutes meetings, and this is from January 3rd. And I'm going to ask Representative Wiens to make a motion on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I propose adopting the minutes of the Metropolitan Governance Task Force from January 3rd at this time.
Thank you. Is there a discussion to the Wiens motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, the motion carries. And we have, again, a number of people who are joining us online. Ms. Beckman, Chair Cleavorn, Mr. Reed, Senator Coleman, Sam Rockwell is joining us online, and then we also have Renee Pereira-Webb and Chair Cleavorn. So welcome to everybody joining us virtually today. So wanted to start off by just previewing our task for today, our primary task for today. And this is the final full day for the task force discussion on ways in which governance structure should be changed, if at all. This is discussion. What we mean by this is different ideas for, everything from the ideas we've talked about already, election, COG, staggered terms, some sort of blended arrangement. I know we have Mr. Adair is here, I've seen, and he has some ideas. So this is the day that we can talk about basically everything else, just to make presentations on that. There will be an opportunity today as well to discuss, we're going to have an opportunity to discuss the public meetings and anything that any ideas and themes that people gleaned from those meetings that we should be talking about today. And then I'm going to go over later on the next three meetings and what we can expect next week, the week after, and the week after that, because we're going to be putting together, our report. And I just also wanted to announce that, Taylor will be out of town starting this evening through next Wednesday, so she won't be here for next week's meeting. But Sally, as well as her colleague Nick, will be stepping in to help. So please keep an eye out for emails that may come from either Nick or Sally. So you might not get the usual Taylor email. So I wanted to, again, make sure you pay attention to that. And if you send an email to Taylor after today, please make sure to copy both Sally and Nick. Do we have Sally and Nick's email addresses for everybody?
Yeah, I will send out an email after today just updating who your points of contact are and stuff like that, so you guys should have all of that.
Great. And so, next week on January 17th, we would like to have recommendations for this report finalized. And we have a proposed process for that. members, any member of this task force can make a motion for a recommendation to be included in the final report. This doesn't have to take the form of a legislative bill. If it could be a one-page or even half a page concept with some bullet points, specific or non-specific as you'd like. And then those we would send in ahead of time. But we know Senator Pratt and I had a fun conversation in his office about things being done ahead of time versus the Senate. So I'm so involved with this 24-hour rule for amendments. I was like, let's get it in by a certain time. And Senator Pratt said, well, but if people want to bring something that morning, that's totally fine. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is a House Senate culture thing. So I'm not going to set a deadline, And we could have ideas just flying around on next. Senator Dibble likes this idea, flying around next Wednesday. But really, Wednesday is going to be the meeting. And as we were playing this, Senator Pratt, he raised a good point as well that there's going to be a lot of ideas and a lot of discussion next Wednesday, and we are thinking that we may want to either start an hour earlier or end an hour later, or at least have that type of cushion so that we don't run out of time. And maybe in the course of this meeting, if you could pass on your thoughts to Taylor about whether it's more convenient for you to come in at 9 or better for you to stay till 1. But let's plan on a 3-hour meeting next week, because this is really the week where we're going to make some important decisions. So excellent suggestion, Senator Pratt. And so again, we'll bring forward an idea. We looked at custom and usage for the LCC in terms of process and task forces. And normally, and you can correct me if I'm wrong or not remembering correctly, Taylor or Ms. Kohler, that ideas have been adopted with a majority vote. So in this case, it would be 9 people would agree on something, and then that would be a task force recommendation. So that is one procedural question that we have gone through in preparation for next week. And this is one where everyone will have to be present in order to vote, not necessarily here, but you can vote online. We're not doing proxy voting. So hopefully, again, if anyone is not here, please let us know. But or if you're going to be here for part of there's a particular vote you want to participate in, let us know. But we really want everyone who plans to vote to either be here or online next week. And again, as I'll just reiterate, any motions you want to make do not need to be a full bill, but a simple proposal that's clear. And if anyone wants to send their ideas to the group in advance, that's fine. But we're also open to people just bringing their ideas that morning, Senate style. And then, so, again, it's just for the sake of the staff and their time, if you could get your ideas in by Monday to Taylor, Sally, and Nick, that's good. Not required, but encouraged. Not required, but encouraged. And that is if you want the committee to see your ideas ahead of time. Bring printed copies of your proposed recommendations to distribute, particularly if you're coming in with some fresh ideas next Wednesday morning. Even if, and so if a motion for a specific model has, again, a majority vote, we've gone over that piece. And you can also bring motions around, and I've talked with Ms. Paddock about this, and others, and we could even do some of this today. But you can also bring motions around themes that you want to make sure are included, that that there's clarity from this task force around ideas such as, I'll give examples: transparency, accountability, et cetera. I think in order for those ideas to be incorporated, I think with a degree of credibility from this group, we should have proposals and ideas and votes on those as well. Okay, so again, just to review this process, these are recommendations to the legislature. They are not binding on the legislature, but it is certainly important that we understand that this is not something that the legislature will automatically adopt. There may be multiple recommendations coming out of this. Obviously, we'll record how much support there is relative to each idea that comes forward. So that is next week. The week after, which is 2 weeks from today, Wednesday, January 24th, Taylor will be back, and we'll have completed and sent out a draft report. So we're actually going to have a draft report in 2 weeks. And on the 24th, this is the chance for members to review the report here as a group and discuss any proposed changes. If there's something in there that you feel doesn't represent the conversation or accurately represent any decisions that we've made collectively, the 24th is the time to discuss those, and it gives Taylor an opportunity to make corrections in the week ahead. And so the draft report will also be subject, the final draft will be also subject to approval by this body. So there'll be a vote on that. And then, and then we come back, I believe, one last time on the 31st. And if there's anything left to sort of clean up or discuss, but that is the process here for concluding task force activities. Are there any questions on that? Yeah, so you were looking very serious and ready to go here. Mayor Hovland.
Yeah, well, maybe I apologize for being a little bit late, and you may have covered this, but I'm just trying to understand what we're walking away from the meeting on the 17th with, and how that influences the draft report, and to the extent I'm thinking about that Blue Ribbon Committee I was on, there was a minority report too. Until there's a main report, it seems to me that's difficult for somebody to write a minority report unless they're writing it off the decision that gets made on the 17th by a majority of the task force. I suppose they could write a minority report based on that. So I'm just trying to understand the process a little bit better on what would be intended to occur on the 17th and what would we be looking at on the 24th. I know a draft report, but a draft report reflecting the majority opinion, is that it?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Mayor Hovland, and that's a good question. And, we would be entertaining a number of proposals, ideas, motions from members and discussing them and voting on them. And obviously, all of those ideas would be incorporated in the report, but we'd also, if there's a majority, that would be a recommendation from the task force. And if there is a need for members who may disagree or want to amplify their ideas in a different way, minority reports are common in these situations. They're expected, in fact, in these situations. And I think that would be up to the individual member to work with maybe Ms. Kohler on on that. Either the member could write it, but it wasn't necessarily Ms. Kohler's job description to write a minority report. But, I mean, I think she could certainly be of assistance in terms of formatting and how that would get incorporated into the report. But we probably have to come up with a deadline so that it could be in the bound version, correct, Ms. Kohler?
Yeah, I think maybe Rep. Hornstein, Chair Hornstein, we could also just do a motion to include perhaps like a minority opinion that is, we have a lot of split opinions on here, so it seems like I should be able to incorporate, I don't have an issue incorporating kind of the different viewpoints if we decide that's what we want to do, but I think if it's going to be something very long and complex that you want included, yeah, we'd probably want it before the 24th then, so it could be reviewed as part of the draft that's being reviewed on that day.
Sure, makes sense. All right. Mr. Chair, I'm sitting here getting a little bit anxious because next Wednesday, the 17th, I'm supposed to be making a presentation in front of the U.S. Conference of Mayors with Bloomberg Philanthropies on the
Oh, my gosh.
local infrastructure hub. So I'm just thinking about this whole timing thing, but we would be able to participate remotely
Yes,
next week?
yes,
It's
absolutely.
either that or I change my flight and have somebody else
No,
cover
you
Bloomberg.
can do it remotely. And I know some airlines, you can even go on the internet. That'd be great. The whole plane would be full of
Yeah. I'll call
discussion
in,
about
I'll
the
call in, and
Metropolitan.
hopefully the door next to my seat won't have blown out.
Right. Yeah, hopefully you're not on a 737 MAX 9. But yeah, I love the whole plane will hear him go, all in favor say aye. What's this guy saying aye and no about all the time? But, we can also, again, we haven't decided, we haven't made a final determination on whether we start at 9 or 10 and go till 1, and if we can accommodate your schedule somehow that way.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll look at my schedule
Okay.
and then I'll talk to Ms. Kohler about it.
Yeah, we want maximum participation from all task force members next week. So we'll try to accommodate people with scheduling issues.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so anything else on Ms. Kohler?
If everyone could try to check their schedules and let me know maybe like as soon as possible after today on what time would work best, just because I have to alert to change the room time and make sure we have it scheduled out. So I'd love to get that done before I leave for vacation, so I don't leave that on task.
We could even take a couple-minute break for people to,
Yeah, so the
That's
faster
all
we
their
make that
preference.
decision, the better. But if you don't have that done,
Mayor.
it's okay.
One follow-on with Ms. Kohler speaking, it reminded me of something that you did last night that I thought was really appropriate, and that was to give her high praise
yeah,
for the work that she's done. And I wanted to make sure that we did that again in this session for all
Yeah.
the
yeah.
great work that you've done, kind of guiding us along here and making sure we stay on task. So
Thank
thanks
you,
for
Mayor
some excellent
Hovland.
work.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mayor Hovland. This has been an extraordinary task force, really, when you look at the amount of volume of work we've done, all the logistical challenges with various meetings, all sorts of guest speakers from all over the country. It's been, quite an effort, and yes, you deserve a lot of, this is not, I will tell you, not easy work. So, great, I'm glad, Senator Pratt.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just wanted to kind of, something you and I have bantied around, and I'd like to maybe get the sense from the committee. You've mentioned a majority of the vote for the recommendation, and we've talked about this being more of a consensus. And is a straight majority of one vote truly a consensus, or are we looking for something a little bit broader? I'd like to get a sense of, we have, as we've seen from the input that we all provided, very different ideas. And as we come together, I'd like to know what the rest of the committee thinks about doing something. I think you had, at one point, thought maybe a 12 vote versus 9 being more appropriate. And I'd like to know what the committee thinks, because we are different than most other task forces that are underway and make recommendations to the legislature.
Thank you, Senator Pratt. We were just banding around whether we need a supermajority for the vote on supermajority, but no, let's take some comments. First, Commissioner Bingham, and then Professor Orfield.
Mr. Chair, I think that Senator Pratt is definitely onto something. I like the direction he's going. My question is to you, and maybe the Vice Chair Pratt, is how are you intending on adding things to the report? Meaning, are you going to say, all in favor of a direct elect, say aye? And if
Yeah.
that's the number, then we move forward and everything else is done. You know what I mean? Like, how are you intending to include things in a report, is what I'm asking.
My thought on that, it's a great question, Commissioner Bingham, is that, members can put forward any idea they want. And it could be an idea from the public that they've heard. But members, whether they're a public member or appointee from a particular group or a legislator, puts forward an idea similar to what a legislative committee would do, and then we vote on it, up or down. But that is all, that's all part of the report, that this happened, such and such idea got such and such votes. If there's no, it's difficult for me to predict what would happen. But if there's no consensus, then at least we know where different ideas stand relative to others. Professor Orfield and Ms. Paddock, and then Mayor Hovland.
I was just going to note that I was on the last task force in 1993, and that was decided by a simple majority on the last recommendations, just as a matter of history, the last commission.
Right. And then I just to reiterate, that's normal custom and usage for LCC commissions, but as Ms. Kohler pointed out, we can make rules as we want to, so. Ms. Paddock.
I like the idea of consensus. I think it would make a much stronger report. It may or may not be possible, as we know. Are there things on which we could find consensus that would still, short of a specific model, provide guidance to the legislature? For example, something having to do with accountability and transparency. Personally, those are rather big, though, without models attached to them. But I was thinking, for example, of it should be a model that is conducive to collaboration, because that is the key. I think that's the key goal of, collaboration as opposed to strong arm fighting amongst counties or whatever the elements are. So I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but can we deconstruct our answers such that there are parts of it that would still be valuable?
Senator Dibble.
I'm glad Mary Paddock's brought up those points, which is a partial response to Commissioner Bingham's question. I think, I don't know how people are feeling or thinking, but my sense is that, the biggest question is between COG versus elected, and I think we're fairly evenly split on that. So and I think that's one question of many. I think there's probably some broad consensus around some other elements that we've discussed, like pay. Some of the elements that go into attentiveness, accountability, transparency, competency, capacity, et cetera, that we have a governing entity that really is up to the task of so for example, if we have a COG and they're not actually elected themselves, who are getting pay otherwise, could we separate that out as an idea and make sure that they're paid so that they can attend to their duties full time? So breaking out some of those ideas instead of packaging the sub-ideas under elected or COG could allow us to find some consensus recommendation to the legislature. I don't think supermajority gets us out of the dilemma we find ourselves in is that we're pretty evenly divided on the main question. And so I don't think that's going to make a difference either way, whether it's 11 or 12 versus 9 votes that prevail in a given question. Because I think legislators are going to see a fairly evenly divided deliberation emanating from this, and will make their own decisions, not based on necessarily the recommendations of this report, but on other factors. And I'll just say, and one of those factors might be the substantive quality of the narrative. You know, so Taylor, you got to do a good job explaining the different positions so that legislators can be fully informed as they decide what they're going to do individually.
Thank you, Senator Dibble. Mayor Hovland?
Senator Pratt's thoughts, plus the comments you made about the complexity of the work we've been involved in for many months, has caused me to think about the value of us being able to read what other people are thinking about. But that might take some time to put together because of all of the information we've had to absorb with respect to, as you point out, Mr. Chair, outside speakers, different models, why people favor different models. We heard that last meeting. Senator Dibble has a different opinion from Senator Pratt. Others have maybe variations on that opinion, and also the status quo with some tweaking. We've heard that from Representative Kosnick. So I'm wondering if we should contemplate here today having a little bit more time to prepare our thoughts in written form, submit them to the chair, Ms. Kohler, have those then disseminated so people can understand them, and then don't vote on the 17th, but vote on the 24th. And I don't necessarily think that we need 2 weeks to do that, but all the work that we've done to try to compress our thoughts between now and Monday in some sort of written form seems to me to be kind of challenging, because I might be influenced by what somebody else's observations were on the same thing that I observed, like the hearing last night, you know, that Senator Pratt, you, Senator Dibble, people that were there, people listening in may have different observations that we all need to think about in the context of reaching some personal conclusions about what we think we ought to do in terms of status quo, modifying the status quo, going to a totally different kind of model. And it strikes me that it's all of a sudden we're on an accelerated track, and maybe that's not so smart, because we've done all this methodical work thanks to you, you co-chairs, and let's not rush at the end just to get something out the door. So that's just a thought for conversation.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that makes sense, but we'd have to really talk with Ms. Kohler and the LCC about how that would affect the timeline around the delivery of the final report to the legislature, which again, I think custom and usage isn't necessary. I don't think anyone from the LCC would be arrested if it wasn't delivered on the first, but, you know, we are under some time constraints with that final report. We're going to have Ms. Paddock and then Chair Cleavorn and Senator Pratt.
I'm wondering if one of the things we can come to consensus on almost immediately would be a diagnosis of what the problem is. I was talking to Representative Weens earlier, and he's been kind of tallying up what the public has been telling us, and the single word that keeps on recurring is accountability, accountability, accountability. And even if our solutions are more dispersed, well, two things. Number one, if we can establish what the problem is, we know what solutions to look for. And as solutions are proposed, if they don't relate to accountability, we can say, that's nice, that's important, but let's focus our report on accountability.
Yeah,
And I would, at a time that it's appropriate today, I would like to make a motion to that effect.
Yeah, and I think that's wholly appropriate. That was earlier when I was talking about the fact that we would be taking votes on some models, COG, Met Council, hybrid, staggered terms. Okay. You know, but we would also be taking votes on some of these conceptual things too. And if you're ready and want to get going today, I would say when we talk about the next item on this agenda, when we kind of sift through some of these process issues, is a discussion on feedback on public testimony. So that would, the next agenda item, I think we could entertain that. Senator Pratt, I think we'll do Chair Cleavorn and then Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Chair Hornstein, and to anyone listening to this conversation. I apologize, I'm on the road. Had a family member enter a hospital in another state, so I have to, I'm not there with you today in person. I do have, just quickly in response to Ms. Paddock, and I appreciate the fact that people want to take votes today, and I'm not present for that, and I may not have cellular reception all the way through the meeting. It was my understanding that we were having discussion today and we were not taking votes, but it is the work of the committee, so I will just say now, if I'm not able to take a vote, it's not because I don't want to, it's because I'm unable to due to location. I think Ms. Paddock raised an important issue, and that is diagnosis of the problem. I don't think we have a clear understanding of the problem that we're trying to resolve. I keep hearing the words accountability, but last night's conversation was more about small towns and communities and townships wanting to make sure that their voices are heard. So I'm not sure that we have clear consensus on the problem that we're trying to resolve. And it's been a problem completely all along the process that we have been meeting. The next thing I wanted to address is Mayor Hovland's conversation about just suddenly trying to get something done and rushing out the door. I think it's really important that we have the time to read other people's comments. There are bits and pieces, again, to Ms. Paddock's comments about, you know, there may be sub pieces that we could find agreement on, and I would love to be able to do that. But in order to do that, we have to have time to understand what those sub pieces might be. And just seeing them that morning, I mean, we could tell from the presentation of the 3 models that we're even trying to discuss, we didn't have those in front of us. So it stymies the conversation to some extent. So I think it's a good idea for us to be able to put our ideas out before the committee so that we can see them. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Senator Pratt?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think there's a lot of agreement around the table that we are a fairly evenly split group, but my motivation for bringing this conversation up is we've talked about, as Ms. Paddock said, improved collaboration between the cities, the counties, the Met Council, the constituencies that the Met Council serves. And my motivation here is to model that, that collaboration here by not, you know, I don't know how a vote would turn out on a COG. I don't know how a vote would turn out on an elected. But what I can say is that if we are going to move forward, if we're going to want a Met Council that's more collaborative, then I think we have to have a true consensus and not just a simple majority. And I think there are, as Ms. Paddock said. And I also think that will maybe push us a little bit to find common ground on areas where we do agree, because we don't want this to be a completely stalemated task force. We do want to find those areas and focus on those areas where we do have strong support across the board. And it may even, quite honestly, Mr. Chair, push us to find a compromise model along the way. So I'm hoping that, you know, all that can be taken into account as we wrap up this part of the discussion.
Thank you. Any other comments? And then I'll sort of rein in, I think, the two issues we want to resolve right now. Representative Weeds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I'm listening to colleagues here, it just kind of reminds me of the process that we have started and just what's the art of the possible. And as Senator Dibble mentioned, it appears to be that there's two prevalent courses of action that are evolving. Last night, we heard what I think are four. The two major ones, the COG and the elected, and then there was eliminate the Met Council, which is a course of action. The other one is do nothing. But I think that belies the point of this task force, and we can screen out two of those courses of action, the do nothing and eliminate. In that screening criteria and conversation with Ms. Paddock, it does have to, whatever we come up as a recommendation and a majority report, it has to do a couple of things. One is accountability, and I've repeatedly, that's the number one thing from all four public engagement sessions. The number one topic is accountability. There's also transparency, there's collaboration, and then it starts breaking down into a couple of different things. I think before, if we have just two courses of action that make that screening criteria, we need to develop the other criteria by which we're going to vote on these. And that is the importance, and we have a definition. So that as we go forward, we're talking about which one does the most to, and then you fill in the blank, what that criteria is. And I think just from Mayor Hovland's point of view, if we have two major courses of action, instead of having a bunch of a la carte issues coming in, we certainly can do that and vote them up and down. And then each of the two courses of action need to address that a la carte issue if they haven't already. But if we have developed courses of action and they are briefed, so to speak, next week, and we can have discussion and we can agree on the criteria and have any other a la carte things addressed, we then go from the 17th, having that in the discussion and voting on whether they go forward, and then on the 24th, have the finished product with any a la carte issues and possibly a hybrid course of action that takes elements of both. I think is a process that I would suggest that we do as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? I have a proposal I might put forward here as chair. Anyone else online? So I think that it's feasible to honor what Chair Cleavorn and Mayor Hovland and others have suggested, which is to move the main decision meeting, if you will, although I think we'll be making decisions on the 17th too, to the 24th. Allow more time and allow people to share their ideas a bit more advanced, all deference to the Senate. And then I think while it does make a bit more of a compressed last week and potentially an additional meeting required, I think we'd meet on the 30th, the meeting that we were going to have on the 31st, we'd do on the 30th this time, right? And so, and then we'd just have a lot of meetings that week at the end, a couple, additional meeting that week. So, so I think this is possible. I think to allow for this extra time does seem to make sense to me, and unless there's, without objection, that model, which we'll kind of fine tune with Ms. Kohler, I think taking some of your ideas, Representative Weens and others, that whole a la carte thing got me a little hungry, but I guess I'd want to know a little bit more. Would an example of that be, for example, when, you know, Ms. Paddock is asking us to take a vote on accountability, for example, as a value? Do you view that as an a la carte thing, or is a la carte more of a hybrid of different ideas. I guess you used that term a few times, and I wanted to.
I think accountability, those things that I call screening criteria that I think you refer to as themes, that is the problem set we need to, all courses of action need to address, how
Okay.
to gain more accountability. I think credibility is in there as well. What I would see is maybe an à la carte, if it's not addressed in the different courses of action, is the separation of planning from operations of a particular aspect, maybe transportation that the Met Council does.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, so I get that problem set, and go ahead, Mayor Hopper.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Representative Weems is onto something here. So what I hear him saying is that we should look at the characteristics of an effective organization and kind of use those as a guideline to drive us towards comments on different models, I suppose, is one way of looking at it. But this, an important element of that is the distillation of the public testimony and seeing, kind of drilling down on what the true issues are there for folks, because there's a variety of reasons that people testify. But I don't want to belabor the point. I think we're on a good track now where we have time to think all these things through and decide how we want to go about the analyses of not only the characteristics of an effective organization, but models that might work best for that, whether it's a variation on theme that exists now or something different.
Okay. I know that we had some of that discussion in December as well. Are there other people that wanted to weigh in on? Rep. Cleaborn.
Thank you very much. The thing is, we also talked in committee earlier about how we would stress test any of the recommendations that are coming forward. So the devil is always in the details, right? So if you say COG, exactly what would that look like? How would we evaluate it? We really need to drill down into the details of COG. We really need to drill down into the details of what is elected. And I respectfully disagree with my honorable colleague, Representative Weems, but the status quo is always an option. I'm not saying it's the best option. I'm not saying it's the option we should take. We should evaluate everything. But to say that we would take that off the table would be disingenuous to the process. Thank you.
Thank you. I've always thought that status quo, and also I think something else that should remain on the table is the staggered terms ideas that several people have proposed. And then anything that comes out today that's new that we haven't seen. And of course, there's also ways to, I think what Senator Pratt is getting at are, as we try to get to consensus, ways to blend certain ideas. I mean, those are on the table too. So while I would agree with the fact that I think when if you were to ask or survey members, a COG and Met Council are leading candidates, but that's before we've talked about different blends or different ideas that could emerge over the next couple of weeks. And I would also agree, Chair Cleaborn, the task force could say that no action is needed, or again, we've had the staggered terms proposal, which is on the table, which I know it does enjoy some support on the task force. So yeah, I think that we want to. Any idea, again, I will say, and we have not forgotten, Senator Pratt, that we need to discuss majority versus supermajority. But I will iterate that it's up to the members to bring these ideas here. And I think it's a good decision if we make that. I think we're on the path to making that a good decision to give people an additional week to prepare on that. Commissioner Bingham.
Thank you. One, I would say, with status quo, I actually don't I actually agree with Representative Weems. It's not an option because there's always room for improvement.
Right.
So that's what I would say. So it's
Right.
not a status quo if you're going to improve it. And I believe that everybody on this task force wants to improve the current process. One way or another, you want to improve it. So otherwise you wouldn't be here. But what I was going to say regarding the very important comment that Chair Claiborne mentioned is the stress test. I think one thing that we might want to get a consensus around is the agreement that any enactment date would be of a future administration. And I believe that was touched on last night by my colleague from Scott County, John Ulrich from Scott County, Commissioner Ulrich. So I believe that allows for the legislature some space and grace to put any language you all wanted in there to test it out, if there would be districts, to get all that jazz done, because I don't think we're drawing districts in this task force. And so I just think if we can agree to that as a principle for any major change like that, that might give some peace of mind, if you will, to folks, that if there would be a major governance change, that would have to be in a later effective date to allow for that stress test. Just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. And, again, if some, I will reiterate, if someone wants to put a proposal on the table the gist of it is that the status quo is fine, we can bring it to a vote. And it reminds me of, I can remember 2 committees in my 22-year legislative history where members brought proposals to the committee and did not get one single vote. It was pretty awkward. They were not my bills. All in favor signify by saying aye, and there were 16 people that were just, So, that would possibly be the result of that. But again, we're not, the point I'm making here is that nothing should be considered off the table for discussion here. Representative Weems.
Thank you, Chair. And I think you sort of answered my question I just wanted to respond to my distinguished colleague, Chair Claiborne, that if we take what would be considered a staffing process to eliminate a couple courses of action, we would still vote on what that screening criteria is or what that theme is, so that nothing is off the board. We can still take a vote on it, but I think one of the members of this task force then needs to be the proponent. So if we have a proponent, Senator Dibble has a course of action, and Senator Pratt has a course of action, and Representative Claiborne wants to do the status quo course of action, then they present that. And then we take a vote on it. So I'm open to voting on it as opposed to having just a staffing process, because I think that's one of the things that much of the public engagement has been frustrated with, is that things get buried or lost in a staffing process. So I think we should have one of us carry it and we vote on it. Thank you.
Professor Orfield and then Chair Claiborne.
Well, just as a matter of procedure, Mr. Chairman, I think when we had the commission the last time, it was controversial, obviously, and some of the work is still ongoing. But when you do complicated things, sometimes having a supermajority reinforces the status quo. I'm very interested in meaningful compromise, but I think that one of the things we thought about last time was a supermajority requirement meant there would be no change, and nobody could get a supermajority. So I'm always interested in creative compromise on things like this, but I agree with Representative Weems that the status quo isn't an option, and I fully support that. And if there's a meaningful compromise, then we'll have a supermajority probably.
So members, just to sort of, we're going to try to finish up this procedural discussion here in the next few minutes, but there's really, just to level set, there's 2 items on the table as I see them. One is the voting process, which Senator Pratt has an idea on, and I think we're going to do that second. But the first thing I would like to finalize would be the dates and the particular decisions we're going to make on these dates, so that people are clear on what they need to prepare and what we're going to be deciding. And so let's just finish this date process first, and then we'll get to the, yeah. After I'm done here, I'll call on Chair Cleaborn. And sort of the nature of what we're going to be doing on those dates. And then we'll talk about the voting process. Very, very important we're having this discussion. I'm glad we have time for this discussion. Chair Cleaborn.
Thank you very much. And I was just going to say, the simple majority versus supermajority conversation, it's truly an interesting one, because if, as Professor Orfield says, a supermajority is going to lead to status quo, and status quo, as some of my members of the task force believe, that isn't an outcome that we can have, then that leads us to a simple majority vote. And if we are divided and we don't have consensus, then what does that lead us to, right? It's a very interesting problem. And I'm always happy to find consensus where we can. And I think to say it's all one way or all another way will not necessarily lead us to a good outcome. And I think we do have to consider the places where we have consensus and then try to build upon that, as opposed to trying to just take a simple majority so that we can say the group has come to consensus. And again, having a clear, defined, workable, understandable problem that we're trying to resolve is the key to all of it. If you don't know what you're solving, you can't have a solution. Thank you.
I agree with you, Chair Cleaborn. I think we're going to start that process in a few minutes on the problem identification issue. So let's do this. And I don't know if on this, Mayor Hovland, and then we're going to have to start making some decisions.
Yeah, I think
Mayor
I'm trying to help answer your question, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
And in the conversation we've had, I was thinking that, how would I, based on the conversation we've had here this morning, how would I go about structuring my comments to try to get them in by the 17th so that people would be able to then read those comments and on the 24th have a conversation, or even on the 17th, if we had it in a day in advance or 2 days in advance, people could ask questions on the 17th about views that a particular task force member had on a topic. But I'm sitting here thinking, okay, we've heard status quo, variation of status quo with staggered terms, COG, direct election, some kind of hybrid. And then if you go either COG or direct election, the size of the districts that Commissioner Bigham raised. So, and then if you think about how each one would go about analyzing this issue in the context of those particular potential models and the characteristics of an effective organization that you want to see relative to those models, what are your personal observations based on what you've learned and what you know and what your experience has been about the status quo, staggered terms, COG, direct election, hybrid, so that everybody's kind of looking at this problem in the same way, and then we're seeing the analysis that's easier to track if everybody's using kind of a uniform template, if you will. At least that's one thought.
So let's just do this. We have two decisions I'd like to make now, and then we'll move on to an evaluation of the public comments that we heard. Decision one, and then we'll have to fill in the blanks here because there are going to be some blanks. But I think the first decision is moving what we were going to do potentially on the 17th out to the 24th. And the rationale I heard from members was, a little bit more time, a little bit more ability for others to respond to these ideas, and that the 17th seemed a bit rushed. We've talked with Ms. Kohler. She feels that, within the constraints she has, it's possible to move up that date. And if the committee feels comfortable with doing it that way, I would move that we do it that way, but.
If you're going to move, we have to do a roll.
But hold on, I think we do want to take a vote on this. Senator Dibble.
Mayor Hovland's proposal would presume that people would be bringing their proposals forward by some deadline so that the other task force members and the public can digest and evaluate and discern and decide what they think about those proposals, which is at some variation to the Senate way, which is bring it on, bring it in at the point of the discussion deliberate, which is how we conduct business sometimes in the Senate, not always. We try to show our work ahead of time. Ideally, we show our work ahead of time to those who might be opposed to our work so that we can surface the issues and not get ourselves bogged down too much in committee deliberation or floor deliberation. I try to abide by that. Don't always do it, though, because it's the Senate way. So I just want to put that out there. I'm not advocating for one or the other. I'm just saying that it presumes that we're going to bring proposals forward for consideration by, the 17th, and then vote on them, or work with each other behind the scenes in discussion on, by telephone to come up with accommodations, compromises, et cetera. I don't know if my question is directed at Mayor Hovland, or if you understand my question. Are you looking for a deadline for people to bring their ideas forward so that there's time for folks to think about them, work on them, revise them, work with each other on compromise so that we're ready to go with some actions on the 24th?
Great question. I didn't finish my thought. So I was thinking that by the 17th, we'd know what folks were thinking, pros and cons of these different potential models or status quo. And then you could have that conversation on the 17th, asking questions of other task force members about their opinions on certain models. But on the 24th, then, we would try to come up with, then people could make a motion on a particular thought that they had and see if they can get a majority vote or consensus or whatever it's going to be, or work your way towards something that I think Senator Pratt would like to see, and that is, all of us agreeing on something. But it may not be possible, but I think if we have that 2 weeks, if we have the week to get our work product in, let everybody analyze it, and then you're going to have questions answered, and then the following week, you would have distilled all of that and know what you were going to argue yourself or how you felt about different models. Then on the 24th, we could start doing that voting.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Dibble.
So would that then preclude anyone coming up with a brand-new idea out of the clear blue sky on the 24th?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
In the context of that conversation on the 24th, I would think that may indeed happen, that as we wrestle through our different views of the Met Council, that we may indeed come up with a hybrid. So I wouldn't preclude any of that. I think it's just kind of an open discussion and maybe motions like anything else.
I'm going to try my best to articulate which we will now know affectionately as the Hovland proposal. And that is that we would have somewhat finished proposals to the committee by a week from today, and then we would be voting on those proposals on the 24th. And Ms. Kohler is going to amend my
No, I just had a question. Do we want to send those out in advance of the 17th so that you can have discussion on those? So then I would propose you have those in by Monday end of day, and then those could be sent out Monday night so that you can have discussion on them on the 17th?
I think so.
So really, the difference from the original is that we're going to use the 17th as a discussion day and the 24th as a voting day. Okay? I'm going to see if Ms. Kohler can maybe jot that down as a rough motion, and then we'll take a vote. This is an important procedural vote, and we should vote. I feel like this is a legislative committee, and nonpartisan staff is writing up an oral amendment.
Can I?
Yes, yes.
All right, so what I have would be the 15th, end of day would be any proposals, rough draft proposals to be sent to me, Sally, and Nick. And then we would distribute those to task force members. What was the date? That would be the 15th, so Monday. End of business. End of business, yes. End of business on the 15th. And then on the 17th, it would be task force discussion on those. Would there be any sort of motions on anything else? Rep. Weems, I know you had brought that up.
I think the Senate rules, since we're a combined task force, new things can come up, but I agree, having a two-day window for us to take a look at like an 80% course of action theme plan that addresses the primary issue, I think that's good, and anything can come in that somebody wants to propose.
Okay, so 17th would not be main motions on models, but something else may come up. So there may be some voting, but it wouldn't be the main model questions. And then on the 24th would be the motions on the governance models and any other large questions. Is that, am I correct on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the Hovland. Okay, we are going to repeat the Hovland motion. And I do have one question before you do that. Ms. Paddock had raised with me ahead of the meeting something that she wanted to discuss today, which I think is important in our chronological movement towards, and it's something that Chair Cleburne brought up too, which is at least to have some agreement on at least one or two problems to be addressed as we move forward. So it seems like as we move towards these models, at least we should have some consensus on at least one problem to be addressed. Maybe there's a few more. And I think it would be wholly appropriate for us, for Ms. Paddock, when we get to the next section of this agenda, to do at least that we want to get that out of the way today rather than wait till the 17th. So I'm just putting that on the table, but that's separate from the Hovland motion. So the Hovland motion as we have it now, Ms. Kohler.
Okay. Do you want me to roll call it?
Well, no, just if you could repeat
Repeat
it
it.
one more time for Commissioner Green and others.
All right, so on Monday, the 15th, end of business day, if everyone could send their proposals or for recommendations for the report to me, Sally, and Nick, and I will send out everyone's emails so that you have Nick's. I know you probably don't. We will distribute those to all task force members that same day, so on Monday. On the 17th, there will be task force discussion on those proposals that were sent around, and there may be some smaller motions related to problems or things like that, but not on the larger governance models and anything major. Those would all be reserved for the 24th. And if we did this, we would need to put a meeting on the 30th instead of the 31st, so that you all have time to review it. Okay, so that,
Professor Orfield.
Yes, I just, to the Hovland motion, it seems that he said it doesn't preclude us thinking about and discussing ideas that may come up from the discussion. We are not precluded from, we're not limited to the written proposals. That's fine with me.
Yeah. Okay. Commissioner Green.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick clarifying question. So no voting on the 17th, just discussion on the 17th, voting on the 24th?
On the bigger items, but there may be some other items that are, more problem identification or other things. We could potentially take votes on the 17th. But in terms of governance models or variations of government models or blended government models, compromise models, that's all on the 24th. Commissioner Bingham, and then I think we got to bring this to a vote.
One other question, is this just specific to governance models, or if there were performance measures or changes that we've discussed, like the divorcing of operations of transit from Met Council, or any of the housing discussions, that robust housing discussions we've had? Is that all included in this, or is this just specific to the governance stuff?
Well, I think that's all under the heading of governance.
Okay.
So I would, that type of question, I think, could be addressed on the 24th. I'm thinking about the 17th could be more of the values, vision, mission type of ideas. I think, as Representative Ween said, it's more à la carte. So, okay. To the maker of the motion gets the last word.
I think that Commissioner Bingham's thought, my thought is that those elements would be part of a report that would flow subsequent to the 24th. So, just to clarifying.
Okay. Elements of a report substitute, what do you mean exactly by that?
From some of your earlier remarks that you expect a report to come out of this task force, that
Yes.
it makes some recommendations.
Yes,
And that would be flowing from whatever occurs on the 24th. So by.
correct.
And maybe part of the motion could be by X date, we'd have a draft of a report subsequent to the voting on the 24th that lets us review that and make comments on that as well. Like, or we can handle it by separate motion, or not even do it now, but wait.
I just want to, I think there was a little confusion here. The report would be, what we are doing on the 24th is actually inputting ideas for the final report. So we wouldn't have any draft report or any reporting done before the 24th. Commissioner Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would like to clarify with with Mayor Hovland, you're not proposing that ideas are held until later. You're saying that the whole discussion is going to happen in this process as outlined, and then the report is generated from all of that.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm assuming that whatever happens on the 24th is going to result in, if there's a simple majority, supermajority consensus, there's going to be a report that flows from that.
Right.
Based on those decisions. And then we'd have time to comment on that, whether we take a supporting position or adopt a minority position. You'll decide
Right.
when those minority reports would be due, so.
Okay, members, we should, again, the custom and usage with LCC is that when we make these decisions, we take votes, and the votes need to be roll call votes because they're including people online. So, so we have, I think everyone understands the Hovland motion, and that's what we're voting on now. So Ms. Kohler will take
Is
the roll.
the Hovland motion being moved by Mayor Hovland?
Maker of the motion, yeah, so moved.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll do the roll call then. Rep. Fornstein,
Aye.
Senator Pratt,
Yes.
Kristen Beckman,
Aye.
Commissioner Bingham,
Aye.
Senator Coleman,
Aye.
Senator Dibble,
Yes.
Commissioner Green,
Aye.
Mary Paddock,
Aye.
Mayor Hovland,
Aye.
Rep. Cleaborn,
Aye.
Professor Orfield. Aye. Ms. Piero Webb.
Aye.
Mr. Reed,
Aye.
Rep. Weens,
Aye.
and Mr. Rockwell.
Aye.
And I think that is everyone who is here.
Okay, what is the tally then? Did we have?
Yeah. Everyone here in
17,
favor, yes.
Okay, 17-0. That's a preview for, I think, a number of our votes on the 24th. 17-0. All right, someone chuckled over there. Thank you, Dick, on that. Okay, we have one more item to address procedurally, and then we have a question around, and then we're going to talk about sort of the follow-up from the public testimony, and then we have some additional public testimony. So 3 more things we need to accomplish here in the next 50 minutes or so. Number 1 is the question of a supermajority. And so do we want, we kind of started discussing this when Senator Pratt raised it. I think he made the case for it. I think that Professor Orfield made a case in opposition. Does anyone else want to discuss having a supermajority? And Senator Pratt, would your idea incorporate any vote that we take to incorporate something in the report, or just simply a governance model?
Mr. Chair, I would suggest that it's anything we incorporate in the report if we want truly a collaborative consensus report overall. And I think it's important to remember that we're not legislating here, we're recommending. And so I think it allows for a different threshold.
Okay. Does anyone want to take a contrary view, and then maybe we could bring this idea to a vote as well?
Mr. Chair, I'm just, definitionally, Senator, are you thinking you want everybody to agree when you say consensus, or are you looking for supermajority? Because I see the wisdom around a supermajority coming out of a task force, but I think could potentially be difficult to get total agreement.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mayor Hovland, my concern is that if we were to do a simple majority, we're going to have 47% of the task force potentially in disagreement. And to me, that doesn't feel like a consensus. I'm not saying it has to be a unanimous vote. I'm just trying to set a threshold to where we can say most of the committee agreed with this proposal. Because as I mentioned, we're making a recommendation, we're not legislating. And there's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of vetting, a lot of changes that happen through the legislative process that we'll be discussing. So it's all very high level.
I agree. I think there's consensus, wisdom in that, and I think a supermajority, 2/3 vote is what you're thinking? At least 2/3, when you say consensus, then is that what my interpretation is correct?
I don't remember how the chair came up with the math, but it sounds like.
Supermajority to me would be 2/3 of the people approve.
It could be 60, it could be 2/3. I mean, yes. Senator Dibble.
I just did the math here. So 50% plus 1 of 17 members is 9 votes. 60% is 11 votes. 2/3 vote is 12 votes. So that's just, so you have that in your head. And then, Mr. Chair, if I could respond.
Senator Dibble.
I fall down slightly in opposition to the proposal, only because no matter what happens, it's going to be clear to the intended recipients of the report, the audience for the report, that there's a fairly, we continue, I don't think stalemate is probably a strong word, but there continues to be a strong difference of opinion. So I think for those of us who want to carry proposals into the legislative session as legislative proposals, the value of the report is going to be the substance of the report, the narrative, whether that's in the majority recommendation or in the minority report, which I'm fairly confident there will be a minority report of some sort or another that comes forward, as well as, reporting out of what the public had to say about the opportunity and issues around metropolitan and regional governance. So that's why I feel now, if the intention of the maker of the motion is to drive compromise discussion between now and the 24th, I might feel differently. So, and believe it or not, I'm open to, compromise conversations. But right now, I just don't think it brings, I think we're going to end up deeply divided, whether, and more likely so, with a supermajority vote than otherwise. Okay, thank you.
I'm going to, we have, okay, Professor Orfield. Oh, you want to go after Professor Orfield or now?
Well, I'm happy to go, I just want to make sure I'm on your list.
Okay, we'll have Professor Orfield and Commissioner Green. Is there anyone on this side? And Ms. Paddock. Those will be the three, and then I think we're going to need to vote because we have other items on the agenda to get to.
I think it would be good to have a broad consensus, but I think a supermajority vote would almost guarantee the status quo. And so I think we know politically that we have to have some sort of a consensus to be meaningful to get a bill passed. But if we have a supermajority, I think a majority vote leads you toward consensus in the sense you want to have something that'll pass. But a supermajority, I've just been around enough supermajorities in my life to realize what they usually result in is nothing. So that's my opinion.
Commissioner Green and Ms. Paddock.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I wanted to ask if you could reiterate something that you said early on, which I interpreted as you're planning that the report conveys the sort of color commentary, the shades of gray, the variation in support for different ideas. And so that's not going to be lost in the report. That's what I think an advantage is to make sure that if that's conveyed, I'm not worried about any thresholds. I just feel like you're going to convey the diversity of opinion.
Well, for Commissioner Green, that's been the intent all along. I think we would also include, particularly if we don't, no matter what we do today, if there's an idea that doesn't get 9 votes or 11, depending on how we define the supermajority, we would still record how many votes.
Yeah.
And this would all be in the minutes and it would all be in the report. But the issue here is, getting us over the top for a recommendation, a clear recommendation. I think that's what Senator Pratt is after. So I think that's really what's here. And so is it a clear recommendation at 9 votes or a clear recommendation with additional votes beyond 9 that reflects a more of a consensus approach? I think that's really the debate we're having here. I'm going to call on Ms. Paddock and then have a motion from Senator Pratt, and then we'll vote. And we were joking in Senator Pratt's office on the supermajority vote. Do we want to have a supermajority for your vote or something? We'll have to think about that. Ms. Paddock.
I just wanted to point out that a consensus is not the same as a supermajority. They're two different things. So I'm looking here at a definition. The best way to determine consensus is to actually read and understand each person's arguments, even if they are divided on the surface. A consensus can be found by looking for common ground and synthesizing the best solution that the group can achieve at that time. So there may be some things that we want to vote on, and we can and should vote on, and there may be some things that we find consensus on, but it's not the same as a supermajority.
We're going to go to Chair Cleavorn, and then I'm going to make some final comments, sort of let the committee know where I'm standing on this one. Chair Cleavorn.
Thank you, Chair Hornstein. And I just want to bring us back to the gravitas of the situation before us. We are talking about changing the governance structure of the largest MPO in our state. We are talking about how that structure will work going forward, how this may or may not impact our federal funding. We have heard complaints or concerns in two of the areas in which this organization currently administers works. We're talking about changing a structure that has taxing and bonding authority. I don't believe that doing that with a simple majority vote is probably the way for us to really weigh the impact of the vote that we're taking. So I just want to put that out in front of the group. I realize this is an advisory task force. It's not the legislative vote, but when we are going into a vote where a large number of the task force members today have said is already deeply divided, then to just say a simple majority consensus is going to allow people to say the task force agreed to. We have to be really careful about how the words of this report will also be used by others. Thank you.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Senator Dibble.
Sorry, just maybe this has been stated, but I don't recall if it has been, so I apologize if I should know this. But when we talk about, I mean, this is to the maker of the motion, Senator Pratt, when we talk about a supermajority, first of all, are we clear? What are we talking about, 60% or 2/3?
Senator Dibble, you know, when the chair and I were talking about it, he threw out 12. I'm open to 11. I think the concept is simply to say, when we put the word recommendation, that it's truly reflective of more than just a 51% position, that it's and again, that we're modeling the collaboration that we want to see happen in our regional governance.
Thank you.
So I could go either way.
I guess I don't care that much either, because I don't think the supermajority vote gains us much, because there will be strongly held views. If we don't work towards a compromise, if it's, going to be a binary one or the other. And are we talking about every recommendation or just like the biggie? There's all these sub-issues that we're probably going to propose and discuss and vote on as individual items and not taken into a big package recommendation.
Well, thank you, Senator Dibble. You're leading me right to my closing comments, so I won't need to do it. But I think it should be, when we put the word, the task force recommends, those words carry a lot of weight. And so I think it should be on every recommendation that we want to put into the report. And the report will reflect the areas of discussion, the areas of gray. But I think when we put our stamp of recommendation on the report, it shouldn't be where, let's say, potentially 47%, because that's 8 of 17, 47% of the task force doesn't agree with the recommendation. And that's the motivation for doing this, is to make sure that when we put those 3 words, the task force recommends, that we can really stand behind it very, very strongly.
Any final comments? I have a few.
Question for you, Mr. Chair. I couldn't quite understand what Chair Cleavorn was taking for a position on the simple majority, supermajority issue. Could you?
Well, I can let Chair Cleavorn speak for herself, but it sounded to me that Chair Cleavorn was interested in, was making a point that given the important nature of this recommendation, the largesse of it in terms of restructuring a major entity in the region, that I think she prefers a supermajority. Is that correct, Chair Cleavorn?
Yeah, I think it goes to the words that Senator Pratt just used. The task force recommends, right? Due to the gravitas of the decision that we're making, I think that a supermajority is a better idea.
Okay, I just want to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. I just make some closing comments. I appreciate Senator Pratt's interest here. I've kind of gone back and forth a little on this question, but I do think that the LCC's custom and usage on this, I think applies. The LCC has had many, many huge issues that it's dealt with over the years. Not just Met Council governance is as huge as we think it is. And I do feel that we, will get, it's really 6 of one, half dozen or the other, in my opinion. I think I agree with Senator Dibble on that. And so, I would come down on the simple majority, even though I think it's a worthy idea to discuss. And with that, we should take a roll call. I think it's a Pratt motion that we're voting on. And so there's 2 items. Did you want an 11 or 12 number for a supermajority of 17?
Mr. Chair, I guess let's go 11. It sounds like the compromise position.
Okay. So the Pratt motion is that for any governance, major governance, and you said it's really for these governance models, that if we wanted to make a vote about whether we want the Met Council to be more accountable, that would be a simple majority. It wouldn't be 11. Everything?
Mr. Chair, I would think that if we're going to put the stamp on the task force
Okay.
recommends, it should be at
For
the.
every vote, every vote. Okay. All right, so members, let me just rephrase or put the item here on the table, the Pratt motion. Yes, Ms. Kohler.
Just a clarification, if we say 11 votes, that assumes everyone is here. Do you want it to be 60%? Because, right, we're going to work off of a quorum. I mean, I presume you all are going to show up and be
And
wonderful task members.
Do you want this vote to be 60%?
Mr. Chair, I'll accede to a simple majority on this vote, but I would say it should be of the committee as a whole.
Okay, so
Those present, or the
60%.
60.
11 total?
Much like we do bonding.
11 total, no matter who is here.
Correct, much like we do bonding.
So an absent vote is effectively a no vote.
All right, is everyone clear on the Pratt motion? Okay, Ms. Kohler, if you can repeat.
Okay, so Senator Pratt's motion would be that all votes, in order to pass, would require 11 affirmative votes, no matter how many people are here. So if someone is absent, that vote is effectively a no vote.
And that is, and if I could just clarify and comment, and that is for all votes related to anything that would be included in the report, correct?
Mr. Chair, anything that includes the words the task force recommends.
Okay. Okay.
All right, we'll do a roll call vote. Okay, Chair Hornstein.
No,
Clarification, Mr. Chair, when you say all people here, That's live or virtual, I take it?
Yes.
You could
yes.
vote virtually.
Correct,
All right,
correct,
thank
yes.
you.
Virtual
And-
votes count.
And for today, a simple majority would be 8 votes because we have 2 members absent. Okay, so with that, anything else before I roll call? Okay, Chair Hornstein.
No.
Senator Pratt.
Aye.
Kristen Beckman.
No.
Commissioner Bingham.
No.
Senator Coleman. Aye. Senator Dibble.
No.
Mary Paddock.
No.
Commissioner Green.
No.
Mayor Hovland.
Aye.
Rep. Cleaborn.
Aye.
Professor Orfield.
No. No.
Ms. Piera Webb.
No.
Mr. Reed.
No.
Mr. Rockwell.
No.
Rep. Weens.
Aye.
So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 votes in favor, so the motion does not pass.
Okay. We have 2 more items. Thank you, Senator Pratt. 2 more items on the agenda. One would be to have members either reflect, or if they have ideas or motions that they want to put forward as a result of any of the public discussion that they would want to do today. And then we will take public testimony. I think we have 2 testifiers at least that have fairly lengthy testimony, so we want to get through this as quickly as possible. Mayor Hovland?
I don't understand why we want to take any votes today.
Well, we'll see. We could put it off. I know one member wanted to propose something and vote on it, but the committee can make that decision. Ms. Paddock, you had some ideas you want to share.
Yes, I would offer a motion now,
Okay?
and this pertains to the problem identification. My motion would be that the task force recommends that the task force recommends that the core issue to be addressed by the legislature is Met Council accountability. We have found both confusion and disagreement about who should be responsible for metro area vision, planning, execution, and evaluation of Met Council projects.
Professor Orfield?
I think that's a good motion. I'd like to amend it by saying accountability to the citizens of the metropolitan area.
Sorry?
Accountability to the citizens of the metropolitan area.
Where would you put that in? I am just raising the question. I'm not trying to propose a solution at this point. I'm just trying to define the issue. And I'm concerned that if we say that we bias it towards direct election, for example, would that be accurate?
I don't think so. I think, in America, all government, the citizens are sovereign from all forms of government. We all should be responsible to the citizens in any form of government that we choose. I think it would bias it toward less accountability. I think if we unincluded the citizens, obviously it's important to be responsible to constituents, but the citizens of the region. If I heard anything from the testimony, it was the endless frustration of normal citizens of the region from being heard in any way by this giant bureaucracy.
Okay, I would take that as a friendly amendment then, such as it would say that the task force recommends that the core issue to be addressed by the legislature is how the Met Council would be accountable to citizens, because one way or the other, ultimately they are.
We have 3 members on the list, 4. I'm going to call on the order that I saw them. Senator Pratt, Representative Weens, Mayor Hovland, and Chair Cleavorn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Paddock, I appreciate the motion, and I think there's a lot of good in there. I would oppose the amendment because I think it does try to bias this body into a directive, because while we want to be accountable to the citizens, and I would agree with that, we've also identified constituencies that are the cities, the counties, the elected officials who also have sovereign representation with those same citizens, those same residents. And Professor Orfield, you weren't on the listening session last night, but I think we heard a very different perspective last night down in Scott County than we've heard in North Minneapolis or at the Wilder Center, and wanting to take that. We want the Met Council to be accountable to everyone it serves. And my fear is not the concept that you're espousing, but actually the phrasing of it in such a way that I think it would start to tend to bias this report before we get to the votes that we want to get to.
Representative Weens, Mayor Hovland, Chair Cleavorn, and then we're going to wrap up this section of the meeting. Representative Weens.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my interpretation of the problem statement is that each of the courses of action that are developed and that will be presented next week will address, if this passes, will address the accountability issue. And I would just ask maybe to do a friendly amendment and add in the towns, the counties, and the townships, along with what Professor Orfield had as an addition or a friendly amendment. So it is inclusive of the citizens and of those sovereign bodies. Thank you.
Okay, well, just a sec. Mayor Hovland, Chair Cleavorn, Professor Orfield, and Senator Dibble, and then I really, we have to bring this to a conclusion and get to the public testimony, because we could debate this a lot, and I don't think this is terribly complex. Mayor Hovland.
Thank you. I'm going to oppose it because I think it's ambiguous. For me, I don't understand if the motion deals with the issue of whether any government agency like the Met Council ought to be accountable, which I think we all inherently believe they should be, or whether this is intended to be a motion asserting that the Met Council is not accountable at present. I think there's going to be a variety of opinion on that in this body as to whether they are or are not accountable. So based on the ambiguity of the motion, I'm going to oppose it.
Professor Orfield, Senator Dibble.
I think that Representative Ween's amendment to the amendment would be friendly, in my view, to my amendment. I think it seems outrageous that we're going to vote against making this accountable to the citizens. I just can't believe we'd vote not to make this body accountable to the citizens. I think that would be a travesty and undemocratic, but I certainly could agree that it should be accountable to the towns.
Okay, so it sounds like there's some emerging consensus here, with one exception in terms of the comments. I'm going to give Senator Dibble the last word, and then we're going to, Senator Dibble, and then Chair Cleavorn, and then we'll vote. Senator Dibble.
So my comment was going to be very similar to Chair Orfield's, or Professor Orfield's. Getting all my titles mixed up here. Yeah, that guy. The guy to my right. So what I heard last night was the towns, counties, and cities saying that the Met Council needs to be accountable to the citizens through us. So I think, in fact, we're saying effectively the same thing. I happen to disagree with their analyses, but I think they were making the argument that direct election is less valuable. What would be more valuable is for us to stand in as intermediaries and vanguard for the public. But it seemed like they were centering their arguments around responsiveness, accountability, transparency, et cetera, to the citizens of the region. But getting back to the core of the motion, Senator Cleavorn argues that, we haven't defined the problem. I think we have, and I think that manifests itself universally and uniformly in everything we heard around the issue of accountability. Out of accountability flows transparency, responsiveness, collaboration, legitimacy. And this will help then guide our work product that we submit next week. Thank you.
Thank you for that perspective there, and then we'll move to Chair Cleavorn.
Thank you, and maybe my comment will be a hybrid of consensus. So there's a piece of me that hears Mayor Hovland that says, okay, I agree with him that accepting this amendment predetermines that we all have agreement before seeing the plans. I think it's not the right time for us to be taking this vote. So that's that piece of it. And then the second piece of it is somewhat an agreement with Senator Dibble's comments just now, that we heard clearly last night that Met Council is accountable already to the public through us, the elected legislature, and through us, the elected governor. It is not, the Met Council is an entity that we, the legislature, have created, and their accountability is being questioned, processed through this task force process. So I think if we are putting the cart before the horse to be able to take this vote at this moment, and I would oppose a vote at this moment.
Okay, we're going to have a comment from Mayor Hovland. Then I would like to have Ms. Paddock, as the author, make her closing comments, and then if we need to figure out these different amendments, or and you wanted to talk, or you're...
Okay.
Okay.
So this is for
Yeah.
the maker.
Yeah.
So if I understood your motion to be in its elemental form, that the Met Council should be accountable to all the constituents it serves, that could be something I think from a concept standpoint I could support. I don't want to be, and I think Chair Cleavorn is making a good point, that I don't want to get the cart before the horse, so to speak, and have us decide right now that they are not accountable, because that's going to be individual opinions that are going to be expressed by the 17th. But should they be accountable to all constituents they serve? That's a pretty simple proposition to me. Yeah, they should be. If that's the intent of the motion, and if the motion were modified to be in that simple form, that the Met Council should be accountable to all constituents it serves, I could support it.
So, Mayor Hovland, let me just, so there's a couple things. One is, I think that statement, or a variation of it, is I think the intention here. And I also think that the timing is important, because, we're getting into more specific problem solving. But what we've heard over and over again, and I think this is what this motion is trying to address, is how can we begin to look at solutions when we haven't identified the problem? And so this is just a simple way to identify a problem that I think we've heard over and over again in the public testimony, whether it was in Lake Elmo or where else. And it's a simple proposition of accountability. And so in my mind, it is appropriate to take a vote today as a precursor to all the other things that come later, that we agree or maybe disagree, but that I think the maker of the motion is saying, do we have agreement in this task force that the primary issue, the primary problem to be addressed is accountability? And so that's really what's on the table. And so what I'd like to do is to see if we can get some language that is either what you stated, Mayor Hovland, or the combination of what Professor Orfield and Representative Wiens had. If we can get something that's simple, a sentence or two, that is okay with the maker of the motion, I think we could then move forward with the vote and then our public testimony for today. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, you know, I wrote down something as Ms. Paddock was, you know, talking earlier. We had accountability as an issue, but we also had credibility and transparency as issues and potential problems as well. Now, what we're talking about is the perception of problems by those who are under the authority of the Metropolitan Council, right? Whether that's individual citizens, the cities, the counties, the townships. This is how they're feeling. This is why we're together. And so I would almost argue that if what you said is true, then we should maybe be looking at those other issues as part of a motion. And I think it would be nice, quite honestly, to have it kind of written out so that we could make those tweaks. We could make, you know, I tried to jot some of it down, but I don't know that I got the whole thing, so. I do believe we have a supermajority consensus around this concept.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to take a vote if that's the decision of the body, but I do think that this is an important piece. If this is the problem statement, then I think it needs to be wholly inclusive of all the problems that we've heard perceived by those, by the constituencies of the Met Council.
I'll defer to the author, and if we want to spend a couple of minutes doing that, we could also start public testimony and try to get this right if we want to vote today. Another legislative thing. Ms. Paddock. And
First to
then,
Senator.
And then Chair Cleavorn.
First to Senator Pratt, I agree that there are other issues. And in my own mind, I came into this thinking credibility is the key issue. But that's a result of other things. I mean, it's a result of, I believe, the questions surrounding accountability. Maybe we can, okay, I'll stop there on that. To Mayor Hovland, what I'm trying to do is not articulate a principle, but a problem. And I think later on, we should articulate the principles, and accountability should be one of them, along with transparency and other things. And I think Representative Weems was talking earlier about almost some kind of a checklist that we would have, you know, these are our criteria. And we had discussions earlier about criteria, and I think we developed quite a list about criteria, and they should play a role in our report too. But I do believe that whether people in this task force individually think that accountability is an issue or not, there's a whole lot of people out there in the public who say it is. I mean, how many people, you know, 100 people did we hear, 150 people did we hear? I bet 90% of them use that word accountability, accountability, accountability. You know, we just can't have a tin ear towards that concept. And then finally, I just want to, if I could,
go ahead,
Mr.
finish.
Chair, repeat my motion, and I have incorporated the things that have been said here, I think, for the most part. The task force recommends that the core issue to be addressed by the legislature is accountability to the public, is Met Council accountability to the public and local governments. We have found confusion and disagreement about who is and who should be accountable for Met Council vision, planning, execution, and evaluation.
Okay, so that is a motion.
That's execution.
We have Chair Cleavorn, Mayor Hovland, and public testimony. If this needs to be worked on, even today, before we take a vote a little bit more, we can do that, but Mayor Hovland.
I think you want Chair Cleavorn first.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chair Cleveland, you're first.
I would prefer to hear Mayor Hovland's comments. Thank you.
To me, this is a prejudgment. I mean, we spent a lot of time this morning thinking about how we were going to go about formulating our thoughts to share with our colleagues based on the testimony that we've heard. Let's not forget that there's about, 3.5 million people that live in this region that the Met Council serves. We probably heard from 100, 150 people. So to prejudge that they're not accountable, to me, is something that maybe we reach as a conclusion after we do all of our report submissions and have a conversation. But I think that this is really a slippery slope to me, and I intend to oppose it.
Chair Cleveland, and then we'll give the maker of the motion the last word.
I think I can agree with Mayor Hovland that I really feel like this is a prejudgment before seeing everything. I would never, ever, I feel like this is a when did you stop beating your wife kind of vote, because if I say no, then it is going to be Cleavorn voted against accountability. Cleavorn would never vote against accountability, but I do not want to bias our work by saying that this is the issue. And whose definition of accountability are we using? This vote is not ready. Words do matter. How we define words matter. And so this is a very difficult vote that you're asking us to take. It is not a simple vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would argue that my motion almost paraphrases what Representative Cleavorn just said. It doesn't say that they're not accountable. It doesn't say that. What it says is, we have found confusion and disagreement about who is and who should be accountable. That is just a fact. If you listened to any of the public testimony or any of our discussions, there's been confusion and disagreement about who is and should be accountable. I think it's indisputable.
Any further discussion?
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
I think that's actually the point that Ms. Paddock and I can totally agree on. And I think that goes to the comment that Mayor Hovland just made. And if the motion is a statement that this task force has heard that there is confusion to this matter of accountability, and that our work may be to clarify accountability, that motion I could probably live with. But the statement that they shall be accountable, well, they are already accountable. The question that we have to clarify is it to the legislature? Is it to the government? Is it the citizens, as Mr. Orfield says, or is it to? So if the problem that you're trying to resolve is the clarification of that question, not that they aren't accountable, but to maybe make it cleaner. That's why I say this is a little bit prejudging. When we see the recommendations that the task force is going to bring forward, whether it's to the COG or to direct elected or to some other hybrid or whatever proposals, then I think I would be more comfortable taking this vote. But it is because we ourselves are so confused as to who is accountable. I've been asking since day one, who do we see as the constituency? And I think, Ms. Paddock, this is the place where you and I have absolute agreement. And so there is accountability. And we have to figure out through our work and through our proposals where we want that to lie.
Ms. Paddock, one more comment, and then maybe I have a suggestion after that.
Mr.
Pat.
Chair, I am in agreement with what Representative Cleaborn just said, and I wonder if we could just add a final sentence. The legislature should clarify these issues of credibility.
Okay.
So what would the motion be?
Yeah, we need to move on to public testimony. I wonder if you could work on the motion now, and I just feel like we're a little behind. We have some people from the public. If we can get the wording in a way that is clear, and then we could take a vote on it, perhaps either now or after the public testimony.
And Mr. Chair, maybe while Ms. Paddock works on the wording, if she could work with our staff to maybe email it to us, so we have it written. Again, I'm trying to transcribe it as she says it, and I'm
Yeah.
not getting it all.
Okay, why don't we do this? We're going to defer a vote, members, and try to get the wording correct, and then we'll hear from the public for while we're doing this.
Mr. Chair,
We're going to have to
this
go probably about 15 minutes late.
This might be helpful, but maybe Representative Cleaborn could text her comments if she's not driving.
Yes,
to
text
Taylor-
if you're
to
not
Taylor.
driving.
And maybe she
and
has.
maybe you and,
Because I think she was headed in a good direction towards. what
Yeah, I
Ms.
think
Paddock
that there was some emerging common ground with Ms. Paddock and Chair Cleaborn. So people can work on that, but we want to hear from the public. I think we first have, let's see.
Republicans, or you can skip Republicans, go to Karen Schaefer,
Okay.
which you have Matthew.
Okay. We have members of the public here, and I'm going to ask people, just because we have limited time, why don't we start with Rich Newmeister and Dick Adair, and then we'll end with our state representative colleague. Oh, Karen Schaefer. Rich, please state your name for the record. Proceed with your testimony. We're normally in about a 2 to 3 minute window here for public testimony.
That's what my testimony is going to be, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Rich Newmeister. My background is I've been involved decades and decades, involved with local, state government on a number of issues. First thing, I think I would recommend that the Met Council have staggered terms, not elections. Now, in terms of accountability and transparency, over the last 40 years, I've done a number of data requests to the Met Council where I see a lot of insight about their workings. A couple things I'd like to recommend. An independent internal audit unit for the Met Council. Just speaking with one of the members of this task force from Washington County, she's indicated how their county has like an independent. I think that is very much needed. Thirdly, in 1993, I opposed the Metro Transit Police when you all gave them authority to have their own police force. Some of the reasons are still outstanding for me. So I am recommending some type of quasi-citizen / Met Council commissioners, whatever they call those, the appointees, group done by the legislature, with language, to oversee the Metro Transit Police Department. This is the only police department, as much as I know in the state of Minnesota, that there's no real elected accountability. The two last things are a redesign of two areas. The appointment process for a commissioner. There needs to be a little bit more availability rather than closed doors kind of appointments. Number two is there needs to be an overhaul of the public engagement dynamic. Now, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, I'm very familiar with language and putting ideas together. Now, if there's an interest on an independent internal audit unit or a quasi-citizen Met Council group to be passed by the legislature for some directions to do some things, I'm willing at any time to offer those ideas, language, or whatever. but it has to come from you whether or not there's an interest on your part with those two dynamics that I highlighted. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, it's a pleasure. I'm now getting ready for near my 50th legislative session. Not there yet, but with testimony and my involvement. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I knew we were getting close to the session when I saw you, so thank you. Thank you, Mr. Newmeister. Next, we have Karen Schaefer from the League of Women Voters. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Karen Schaefer. I am here in my capacity as chair of the Council of Metropolitan Area Leagues of Women Voters. Our organization is an interleague organization. Our members are all of the members of the 19 chapters of the league that currently exist in the metro area. We were established in 1962, prior to the Met Council, of course, with the exclusive purpose of increasing knowledge and effectiveness of our members with respect to regional government. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the League, we're a nonpartisan, volunteer membership organization comprised of men and women aged 16 and over. We do not support candidates or parties, but we do study selected issues such as metropolitan governance. We had a study in 2018. We issued our report in 2019, and we did something unique in our history. We launched 37 individual league members to interview local elected officials in the counties, cities, and towns for 52 of those units of government. We wanted to ask them what their opinion was of the Metropolitan Council governance and what services they thought they were receiving from the Metropolitan Council. So then we had some other research. So once our report was finalized in January of 2019, the local chapters, all 19, met to discuss the report and vote on potential positions regarding Metro Council governance. And the voting in all the 19 chapters, they were all aggregated. It showed a minimum of 82%, but up to 94% agreement among our participating members on the following positions. The governor should appoint the members and the chair of the Met Council. Members to the Met Council should be appointed to fixed, staggered terms, removable only for a cause. Metropolitan Council members should have a regional perspective, knowledge of regional issues, demographic diversity, and the ability to meet the time requirements for serving in the office. Metropolitan Council members should not be local elected officials, nor should they be directly elected. And finally, a nominating committee should recommend a slate of council nominees to the governor as part of an open process that includes citizen, local government, and legislative influence on the appointment process. All of our report and discussions of the interviews that we held with local officials and, in some cases, appointed staff such as city managers, et cetera. All of our materials are included in the Blue Ribbon Committee report, where we also testified. So our full report and all the background data are included and available to you. I would just say, as one final note, only of the elected officials that we interviewed in 2018, only 30% of them favored appointment of local elected officials. They felt that elected officials would be better at communicating and they would increase accountability. And I wrote these remarks before I listened to your discussion today. But 70% of the local people that we interviewed, they did not support a local appointment of local elected officials. And the reasons they gave were the usual. One, they wouldn't have enough time to do a good job, and they would have incompatible interests associated with serving two different constituencies. So I appreciate the fact that, appreciate the opportunity to present our remarks to you, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Appreciate your coming. I understand that Mr. Neumeister, I don't see any questions, so thank you, wants to correct the record on something he said.
Mr. Chairman, someone from the Met Council who's now present here indicated to me that the Metropolitan Airports Commission has a police unit that would be very similar to what the Metro Transit Police is.
Okay.
So that was my mistake.
Okay, it's all right.
Just to clarify that. Thank you very much.
No, duly noted. We have Dick Adair here, and then followed by Representative Elkins.
Thank you, Chair Hornstein and staff. By way of thank you, I'd just like to comment on two things that have really stood out to me from listening to you guys over several months. Number one, you're amazingly patient in listening to public testimony, and I'm just really surprised by that. Number two, you are very respectful of each other's differing opinions, even though there's obviously some pretty major differences here. And I would like to go on record finally as thanking the Met Council and Project Manager Jim Alexander for the Southwest Light Rail Transit line. Yes, there have been trouble with construction and soaring costs, but in the long run, I think we're going to be glad to have a diagonal 14-mile transit way entirely on its own right-of-way that will be in the public domain forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adair. Next, we have our colleague who, speaking of sitting patiently, Representative Elkins has been involved in this issue more than just about anyone else in the House. He is a former Met Council member. He sits on the State and Local Government Committee. He has attended several of the public meetings. Saw him last night in Shakopee. And he's attended almost all of our meetings and wanted to, we'll just use this opportunity as one of our last meetings before we start digging into structure issues to share his ideas about that matter.
Mr.
So,
Chair, can I
yes.
quickly interrupt before Representative Elkins speaks? I know people are leaving. I have to leave. I was supposed to be somewhere at 12:30.
Yeah.
Ms. Paddock has agreed to hold her motion off until
Yeah,
next meeting.
so if, for those that are waiting for a vote, we will be tabling this motion or now as it's tabled, and we'll be returning to it next week, first thing. So thank you for that, and proceed, Representative Elkins.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, so how much time can I be allotted?
Well, we're losing a few folks. I mean, if you want to come back, start this week and you can come back next week, that would be fine too. I don't know how much time do you have? What is the length of your prepared remarks?
I've outlined the remarks that I would like to make, and there's probably like 15 minutes, probably. There'll be some conversation, so it would probably be more like 20 minutes at least.
Okay, that could push us a little bit, maybe. If it's okay.
It's okay,
If you
yeah.
want to start, and then we could have you
Yeah,
back.
I can prioritize. I mean, there's one thing based on the conversation that I'd want to, get in front of you right away, and I can
Okay.
also turn my outline into written comments as well.
Yeah, and speak into the
Still?
microphone. We've had a request.
We're still doing, okay.
I would.
Is that better?
Yeah, I would
Okay.
propose maybe you start, and then even though we have a packed agenda next week, if you feel that you had additional items, you can come back, but we'll try to get the bulk of yours now. Senator Dibble.
And Mr. Chair, I would, if Representative Elkins is willing and able, even before next week, to transcribe or transform your remark. I'd like to read them before, as we start to prepare our proposals that we are actually going to be bringing forward next week. We should be informed by your thoughts.
Yeah,
before
I
then.
sent a copy of my outline to Taylor, and she has that, but I can flesh it out between now and then. So I'll just focus on one part of the discussion that you guys really seem to be homing in on, and that just the practical issues with using a council of government form. So, early in the discussions, there was, some commentary about, which are more important, cities or counties, with, both parties expressing some sentiments that they felt insufficiently appreciated. And what I would say is that I think cities and counties are equally important in the Metropolitan Council process. They're co-equal partners. Relatively speaking, the counties play a relatively larger, though not exclusive, role in transportation planning, especially the planning of transitways. But cities are in complete control of the land use. And the kind of the genius of, how the Met Council works, to the extent that it does, is that because we can coordinate transportation and land use and other system plans like wastewater treatment as well. And I think we do a better job as a region than any of the other regions that we've heard here. I think we do at least as well as Portland. If in terms of councils of government, I think that, the Denver Regional Council of Governments, which you heard from, is probably one of, if not the most highly functional council of governments in the country. But we still do far better than they do in terms of coordinating transportation and land use. Their major north-south transitway runs alongside of a freeway. Most of their best transit-oriented development is nowhere near transit. If you look at projects like Stapleton in Denver, or Belmar in Lakewood, those aren't on transit lines. They're really exemplary developments. But almost all of the good transit-oriented development in the Denver region is limited to downtown Denver. So if we were going to have a council of governments, and it was going to have both city council members and county commissioners, you guys have been chewing up the issue of proportionality, and on that I would just remark that in any proportional system of either appointed or elected Met Council representation, majority of the representatives are going to come from the combination of Hennepin and Ramsey counties, but I would observe that at the same time, most of the representation will come from suburban communities, even under a scheme where most of the representation comes from those two counties. But there's another tension here that you guys really haven't discussed yet in the Council of Governments discussion, and that's the tension between the counties and the cities. And that tension arises because, in my opinion, while most of the counties have higher paid members, most of the members are either full-time devoted to their county commissioner jobs, or may have side hustles but spend most of their time on their county commissioner jobs. They would be able to carve out a sufficient amount of time to be able to fulfill the dual roles. When I was a city council member in Bloomington, I estimated that I usually would spend on average about 10 hours a week on a city council. City council members around the region rarely earn more than $10,000 a year. Unless you're retired, you have to have a full-time job. It's only going to be a part-time gig. And when I was on the Metropolitan Council for 8 years, that job took me on average 20 hours a week. So especially during the time when we were rewriting the major policy documents, which is where the current council is right now, I literally for 2 years spent all of my day job vacation time attending work group sessions related to the drafting of those documents. Frequently during that period, or during my whole Met Council tenure, I frequently found myself having to come into my day job office on Saturday to play catch-up on my day job for all of the time that I had spent on Met Council responsibilities. So if you take a city council member who's putting in 10 hours a week on that job and then ask them to add another 20 hours a week to spend on Met Council business, it's just not tenable. So you're not hearing support for a council government's form from organizations like Metro Cities. I see Ms. Nauman may have disappeared. But that's because the cities understand that at any mixed council of governments form, it's going to be dominated by the counties because they're going to be the only local elected officials that have time to devote to it. And so you're never going to find broad-based support among the regions, cities, for a council of governments that is either county-only or mixed county and city elected officials. It's just practically not practical. That would be my priority for today.
Okay, thank you. We hope to hear back from you, and I appreciate that, and you'll circulate your thoughts as well per Senator Dibble's.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vice Chair Elkins. Okay, we have a couple of more things, just quick things before we adjourn. Senator Pratt wants to read into the record some testimony that was dropped off last night. So if he could do that, members, if you could pay attention here to Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me start off by thanking everyone that came down to Scott County last night in person or online. And thank you, Ms. Paddock, for holding down the fort here at the Capitol. But I did receive this email last night, and I just wanted to make sure that it was part of the record. He starts, I attended the task force meeting at the Scott County Government Center this evening and was unable to speak due to the large number of people that were already registered. I would like and very much appreciate if you would include my testimony in the task force deliberations and findings. He goes on to say, over the past 50 years, the Met Council has been tasked with doing more and more things: transit, wastewater, land use planning, parks, affordable housing, and more. It is clear, though, that the organization and the structures put in place over those 50 years are no longer sustainable or properly functional. It is not reasonable to expect a single entity to do so many disparate tasks well. Instead, in order to get best-in-class results, each of the Met Council's responsibilities should be reassigned to state, county, and local agencies with relevant expertise, with the new agency, of course, receiving the budget monies that would have been earmarked for the task. In addition, a key part of the reassignment process needs to be asking if any centralized agency should be doing the task, or if a decentralized approach is more responsible to citizens, or responsive to citizens, or if a task should be done at all. Trying to determine a better governance model for the Met Council is a failed approach. Any of the proposed changes won't really fix the underlying problem with the Met Council. Only dramatic and audacious steps to remove the responsibility for each of these duties from the Met Council can do that. Mike Staff, Prior Lake.
And that's in task force, the member folders as well.
That's in the member folders. And then I actually need to read one additional item. Thank you, Senator Pratt. This is a short piece from Jim Nakora, who lives in the Sika condos. Many of you know that was a ongoing issue with the Met Council. This is the building literally feet away from the alignment for the Southwest Light Rail. So there are pictures, I believe, in the packets that Mr. Nakora has provided for us, but I did want to read a little bit of short narrative from him into the record. One of the ideas I've thought about for the Met Council restructure would be to redistrict according to population within elected entities. The number of districts could be changed to accommodate population and development trends. Municipalities or groups of elected entities within each district would appoint their Met Council member. I believe operations and planning could be separated, and transit which is or should be connected to statewide or national networks and be a function of MnDOT. Thanks for allowing me input. I'm sorry it didn't work out for my testimony to be read aloud, and thanks for all of your hard work and support. So those pictures are in your packets, and again, we heard from the condo residents at our meeting in North Minneapolis. Members, one last thing before we adjourn. Me and Ms. Kohler have been in conversation, and given the rich and helpful and conversation as we progress on process today, it feels to me that we not only need to have a 3-hour meeting on the 17th of February, we'll definitely need a 3-hour meeting on the 24th. But I felt like we did really make some good progress on proceeding from here and giving members enough time and the public to evaluate some of our ideas. We've set aside, I think, a good process. I appreciated, Ms. Paddock, your ideas and on the problem and accountability, and I appreciate that will be worked on and refined more for next week. That is the idea here. And I see no more business before the, oh, Ms. Paddock.
I'm not seeing those pictures.
Oh, are there?
It's, I'll
Okay, well, if. Okay, all right, those are the pictures from Mr. Nakora. I see no further business before the Metropolitan Governance Task Force. Thank you very much, members, for a good discussion today. We stand adjourned.